On behalf of the government, I'd like to thank you for turning up to a forum like this. I've only just joined, but even the brief conversation I heard coming in here sort of highlights some of the issues we need to deal with. I think there's a grand challenge here for us. The mining sector, we all realise that there's great number of elements in the mobile phones we use. I often use the story that because of the rise of renewable energy, the rise of electric cars eventually, the amount of copper we've got to find globally is we've got to find something like 3 Olympic dams every year to supply that amount of copper for the world, really. And happily South Australia is going to be part of that journey. It has been for quite some time and will continue in the future. But land access, getting on the ground, relationships on the ground is probably, I think, if not certainly one of the key factors in achieving that aim, and possibly is the hardest of all of them. Technology's improving, we're mining deeper underground, we've got better detection methods. And yet the area that's probably holding things back is this area of land access that we've been talking about today. But how do you do that? Now, I'll get through this conversation, but last week I've had the pleasure of, or privilege of, in fact, leading negotiations with Narungga people over a treaty, the beginnings of a treaty in South Australia, the first of 3 that we hope we can do. In those couple of days, I learnt more about cultural awareness than I have in any other cultural awareness course I've ever been on. So I have a far better understanding, and I realise I've got a lot more to learn before I can even call myself vaguely competent. And at its heart, this is what this is all about. It's this conversation of traditional owners of the land who have got custodianship of what they have to look after, and miners who, Rob just outlined it, there's a need to sort of get in, do things quickly, get out and do it in a cost-effective way. And then kind of, how do you make those two things sort of line up? That's the challenge. And I take the point about information, we want to remove, information, what we call the information asymmetry. So you need to know, as landowners, if you like, who is knocking on your door. And I think it's a very good suggestion that we can take on to see, well, how do we get that sort of information out to you in a way that you can use and understand and not have to spend too much effort worrying about it before you get to the face-to-face sort of interaction. I think, the new digital world that's coming is going to give us a lot more tools to make that happen a bit easier. I think I can see a day when farmers, traditional owners, anybody that's a stakeholder in this mining sector will have on their iPhone most of the information they need before somebody turns up. Because that initial interaction, in my experience of 20-something years in the mining, in the mineral exploration sector, tells me that first interaction is the most important one that you're ever going to have. If that goes right, then you've got a chance. If it goes wrong, you spend a lot of time trying to repair it if you ever can. And so what we're talking about, here in these couple of days is actually really important as to how do you get the rules of engagement sorted out right up front to give you the best chance of forming a relationship that's going to go on. Because one thing about mining, which is a good thing, that once a mine first thing, it's bloody hard to find a mine. They are very, very rare things, right? So exploration, a lot of exploration's got to go on. You've got to kiss a lot of frogs before a mine appears, right? So, but when a mine is there and the investment's made, everybody's incentivised to keep it going for as long as it can. So once a mine is there, it will go for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And there's a constant sort of cash flow coming back to the company, to the government, and to the communities that live around it. So there's a good reason for having them in your neighbourhood, provided they're done environmentally well and all the rest of it. You're contributing to the larger need of the world, as people come out of agrarian economies and farming economies into cities and become more middle class, they're going to need more metals, and we've got a responsibility to do all that. So look, I'm just going to sort of skip through what we're doing and what's happening in South Australia, just to sort of bring everybody up to date with what's going on. This sort of slide just sort of is the pitch really for why invest in South Australia at all, particularly for companies that aren't in South Australia at the moment. We have a number of globally significant provinces, the Gawler Craton being the main one, sitting in the middle of that map on the top left-hand corner. It's significant because it's got some of the oldest rocks in the world to the youngest, and what that means is over geological time, there's been various times in history when most of the iron ore appeared, or most of the gold appeared, or most of the copper appeared, and we have all those segments in the geology here. So everybody knows that, everybody will keep coming back and exploring. The challenge we have in South Australia, of course, is because it's such an old continent, it's been eroded flat, and so what you've got out there is you don't have outcrop anymore. You've got a thick layer of cover of various sorts which obscures what's underneath it. So it's expensive to explore here. The rewards might be there, but it takes a lot of money to eventually come up with a drill hole intercept which may lead to an ore body. So the costs of getting from that early stage to the later stage is higher in South Australia than in most other places for that reason. But you know, the rewards are there. So Olympic Dam, for example, is one of the richest, you know, in terms of metal in the ground, it's one if not the richest ore body in the world. And we know from the science we've done that there's more of those to be found in that area. So the trick is, how do we find them? We work hard at developing a stable regulatory environment. So remembering that we're an international game here, investors can go anywhere in the world, but increasingly they're looking for stable jurisdictions where they're not going to get caught up with strikes, they're not going to get caught up with NGOs. They want stability above all else, because you're investing for a long, long time. It makes no sense to go to a place where you can't be sure about what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Government has had as a bipartisan support for mining for a long time. South Australia led the charge in what we call pre-competitive data generation back in the 90s. The government, when it was actually going through the state bank collapse, and so it had no money at all. But a guy called Ross Farden managed to convince the Treasurer at the time that, well, another $20 million is not going to make any difference to you, but it could make a big difference to us. And so he gave us the money. We flew the state with magnetics, and that's led to a whole lot of discoveries since then, just because the geophysics can tell us a bit about what's going on underneath that cover. We have a brand new core library at Tonsley, so it's become a bit of a hub of innovation and activity, very well worth a visit. And we have an active and progressive native title regime here. And I think, personally, from what I see, overall, good relations with native title holders and potential native and future native title holders. I think the beauty of South Australia is it's small enough that everybody actually knows each other, and so you've got a chance here of working things out. So, and this meeting for these couple of days is just one example of that. Major mines that you'd be aware of, BHP, of course, going through an expansion phase right now. They're redeveloping their processing plant, which will allow them to expand production. They're talking publicly around about 300,000 tonnes of copper per annum, going up to maybe 450, 500. Oz Minerals, you'll have heard about with Prominent Hill, which has got many decades mine life ahead of it in Carrapateena, down south of Olympic Dam, which is one of the most economically sought after copper deposits in the world right now. And Arium, so I've just come from Whyalla. I've been heavily involved with the negotiations with Sanjeev Gupta over the sale of Arium. So you go down there now, you've got signs everywhere, there's a lot of buoyancy in the town, and he's got huge plans for the Upper Spencer Gulf and regions, and something to watch out for. Things that are happening just recently, WPG Resources reopening and re-energising the Challenger gold mine, which started out as quite a tiny, weeny little gold mine out in the middle of nowhere. Now it's well over 1 million ounces of gold in that deposit. And Cairn Hill as a bit of a sleeper, but it's a Chinese group Chinese-backed group that are working in and around Cooper Pedy, producing 1 million tonnes of iron ore at the moment, planning to go to 3 and then higher if they can in the future. So things are certainly starting to move again in the South Australian sector. There's a number of exploration licences and mineral leases, quite a large number. Here are the metrics that we sort of governments like to see, in terms of what are the royalties, what are the production, how many people are employed by the industry. We know that it always hovers around about 10,000 directly employed, but we also know there's another equivalent number out in the services sector as well. You can see the production graph up there. It's sort of tapered off in recent times, but the forward curve is far more positive. Royalties is now a very significant part of the cash flow of the state, so it will increasingly get more and more government attention. I think this is an important graph just to sort of see where the mining sector sits in the South Australian economy. So this is a graph of exports over time, basically from 2001 to 2017. The orange bit in the middle is the minerals and petroleum sector, dominantly minerals in terms of export. So it's 3.8 billion. Is the same currently is the same as ag and food in South Australia, but has got. The thing with ag and food is there's been a lot of innovation, big innovation in the food sector, so it's growing, but it can only grow at a certain rate, whereas really the mining and petroleum sector there's no limit on the upside, other than it's the rate of investment, the rate of exploration that will determine what that export graph looks like. But it's a big flywheel. For South Australia, it's a really important bit of the story because it's just a big flywheel that just keeps chugging away, generating income for everybody related to it, and it goes for a long time. So that's why it's worth investing in. It's why it's a long game we've got to play with this one. So, but you can see from that graph, imagine if that orange section in there had not happened back in 2004, we'd be in a pretty bad shape. So it's, mining really does kind of underpin the state in many ways. Exploration licence applications have started to pick up. Copper prices topped $7,000 US the other day. We're back in. The mining sector is coming back to town. There's no doubt about it in my mind. And there's various graphs, various indices that you'll see where we've been in a downward spiral for a while. It's turned the corner. We're back into business again. So you'll see more investment, more explorers turning up, trying to find that elusive copper, gold, and uranium. What are we doing? What's government doing? SARIG is an online, very detailed online database system that we have. But I would encourage native title groups to, if you haven't already, sort of dive into that and help us modify that, because a lot of the information you need is in there. But it's a very rich database, so it takes a little bit of training to get your head around what's actually in there. But I think that's something we can certainly do as part of this exercise. We're going through, a Mining Act review, so we're trying to be. It's as close to a blank sheet of paper as we can get with these things. You've always got to build on history and case law with what you've got, but we really are. This is a very genuine attempt by the government. We have a window of opportunity right now to move the dial on this, and that's what we're trying to do. We have a series of strategies. So companies tend to focus on a single commodity these days, so that's why we have a copper strategy for the copper miners, a magnetite strategy for the iron ore guys. We're developing a gold strategy for the gold sector, and down the track we'll look at lithium, boron, cobalt, the metals that are tied up with batteries and the sort of new technologies that are coming along. But we are absolutely committed to Aboriginal engagement. I'm right now very committed in the treaty process we're going through. I've worked up in the APY lands for a long time to try and help the APY in their lands develop a mining sector. We haven't got there yet, but the understanding up there about mining exploration is a lot better than it was 10 years ago, that's for sure. There's any number of good stories out there about interaction with mining companies and Aboriginal groups. Don't get to hear about them very often. That's I think part of the problem. If people can sort of learn by, and each one of these stories is a little different. There's no one size fits all. Various Aboriginal nations have got their own history, culture, structure that anybody coming into their area needs to understand. If you do, then you're going to be in far better shape. So Amiak up with Oz, up at Prominent Hill. Heathgate have been working with Aboriginal people for a long time and had a target of 20-25% employment and have managed to keep that for a long time. So that's a great story. The Cookatha with Oz partnering at Carapatina. I was talking to Joylene about this the other day. Sort of why is this? It seems to be working very well. And her take on it was that Oz spent a lot of time just trying to develop the trust part right at the beginning. Before we got onto agreements or anything else, a lot of time just who are you, who are we, how do we establish some way of trusting each other. And in that particular case, I think Andrew Cole as the boss just made sure everybody kept turning up until that level of trust was achieved. And it's a different conversation when you talk to the Cookatha now compared to a few years ago. It's a completely different conversation, and they're now struggling a bit with, okay, there's jobs and opportunity coming, how do we now gear ourselves up to take advantage of it? Aluka, again, another very good story. Aluka wanting to set up a mine in the middle of a national park effectively, tackled that early engagement not only with the Aboriginal groups but also with government in the best possible way. Now, I think if we try to do the same thing right now, we'd really struggle to get this across the line. But back then, again, willing governments, a very good plan for Aboriginal people, which they've built on. So, and that started at the exploration stage. Actually, a lot of the big gains were made in the very early stages of exploration, where they actually hired a lot of the local Sejuna Aboriginal elders to be part of the team. That was a genius sort of move, and it just sort of created a feeling of goodwill that has kept on going. So, the future. There's no doubt in my mind we're coming back into another boom situation, which will bring with it all the stresses and strains that they always do. Not enough people, people wanting to move too fast, that kind of thing. But we are trying to set ourselves up with a decent, like a world-class regulatory regime. So our aim is to come up with something which globally people are going to say, well, what are they doing in South Australia? Let's do more of that. We want to have this in partnership with Aboriginal groups. It's just common sense. So what does that mean at a high level? What does it mean at a detailed level in terms of information flow, make sure everybody knows what's going on, who's who in the zoo, all that stuff. I think longer term, a greater willingness to look at partnerships in whichever form they take. And there's plenty of examples around the world of what good practice looks like. And we've got a way to go there, I think, but the willingness to do it is there. So I think that's all from me. So thank you very much for your attention.